What I'm going to talk to you about today is there are a lot going on in criminal justice in Israel these days. It's actually very exciting times to be a lawyer, which is always, and we kind of rethink a lot of what we used to think about punishments and about prisons, and it's a trend that started around the world, except the US, which we'll talk about in a second, and starting to move on to Israel, and actually we're in a really exciting times. So I want to first take you back about a decade ago, like 2009, and a decade ago it seemed as if Israel is just following the footsteps of the US. And what happened in the US, more or less since the 70s, is what we usually call the incarceration crisis or the mass incarceration of the US. There's been a huge leap in the number of Americans incarcerated. Lots of them are black. There's actually, one of the figures is that if you are, I think 25 and black in the US, you have more of a chance to be in prison than you are to graduate from college. So this is a lot about race in the US and a lot about how the US deals with criminal justice and with crime rates. And it seems as if the Israel is following this, The question is, what's the difference between jail and prison? So jail is mostly for shorter prison sentences. A lot of time it would be in the state prison, in the state jail, and prison is for longer sentences. And what you can actually also learn from this graph is that the prison sentences there's not only more people in prison, but the prison sentences are also longer, meaning people get sent to longer years in prison in America now. And just like to give you kind of an international perspective, this is how remote the US is in terms of its incarceration rate. Meaning this is like most of Europe and such, and the US is just off the charts. This is Israel. I'm really sorry that the graphs are in Hebrew. It's from PDFs, so I'll explain what's saying. Israel is in red in both of them. So what we see here is first that we have a lot of use of prison sentence in regard to other sentences. So about 40, I'm trying to know. It's about 0.42 are in prison in regard to fines and other punishments, and 177 people out of every 10,000 are in prison. And again, if we return to the US, you remember the 698. So we're not there yet, but we're still very high up in comparison to other countries. And this is like, if we talk in numbers, we see there's a slight decrease actually in people in prison in Israel in just like the last 2 or 3 years, but it's mostly stable. I would say, just so you got your numbers right, that these are only criminal prisoners in Israel. There are also about 6,000 what we call security prisoners, which are people who are incarcerated for security felonies, and there are about 600 migrants who are in migration detention. This number used to be higher, but now it's somewhat along the 600. Talking about security prisoners is a large topic, and we'll not discuss it now, mostly because what we're talking about is criminal justice policy and how we relate to crime, and security prisoners are usually, the number rises and falls more in regards to the security situation than what we're talking about. So, but I just wanted you to have the numbers. And as you can see, even if we compare Israel to similar countries in many, like in terms of size of the population and such, these are mostly the Nordic countries, which we'll return to later on, because Finland is a very interesting story. You can see we are much higher than that, and this is the figure that I've lost before, which is how much we use prison in comparison to other sentences. And the number is, I think today it's closer to 40%. And the question is, okay, so you tell me, okay, we need to fight crime somehow, and the way we need to fight crime is by putting people to prison. But the thing is, Israel doesn't have that much crime. So, if we compare it to other countries, we have like a mediocre amount of crime. And not only that, the crime rate is not only decreasing, actually, I don't know, like falling down in the last decade. This is the crime rate in the last decade, and it's a constant trend. It's actually a trend that happens elsewhere in the world, meaning crime rates are going down, mostly in the developed world and in Israel in specifics, and it does not match the rise in prison. So you cannot say, well, we use prison more, so the crime is declining. So this is not the case. So why do we use punishment? So now I want to kind of like go back from the graphs and such and try to show you why do we use the prison sentence that much if we don't have the crime rate? And the answer is there is no, there's no need to do that, basically. So up until the 90s, more or less, the way all criminal justice specialists thought was, okay, let's put this in an equation. So we put the chances of someone to get caught and the punishment he's going to get, multiply the one by the other, and this is what will make him decide, do I want to commit this crime or not? So if, for example, I enjoy robbing the elderly very much, I will say, okay, I have about a 50% chance of getting caught, and I will spend 2 years in prison if I do, so I have this 1 year calculated prison sentence. But I actually enjoy robbing the elderly a year and a half. So, okay, I'll do it. It's worthwhile. Like our basic 101 economic thought. The problem is that when you put this to test, none of the data actually supports this. One of the things that was most studied in criminology is this question: does increasing the punishment create deterrence? And if there's one thing criminologists would agree on, is that the answer is no. Then if you try to think, okay, why does it no? So first I tell you that it's not correct because of the studies that was done. There were studies that were created, like they had all these experiments, when you add the punishment and nothing changes. And they had like natural experiments in which the punishment rose, but still there was no effect on crime. And then, well, you try to think about it, but why, Let's take our nice elderly robber. He got his math right? And there are actually a few quite intuitive explanations to why this doesn't work. First is that people, yeah.
So does this hold even when you increase the punishment like drastically, like capital punishment for every minor felony? Will this still hold?
This actually is the extreme that does work. So for example, when you have like some natural experiments in which, let's say the legal system collapsed totally, so no punishment for nothing, you do see a rise. But this happens only at the margins, meaning if you either kill everybody or have no law at all, you will see an effect. But let's say, well, your everyday new bill, okay, someone robbed the elderly, let's put it 10 years on elderly robbery. This virtually makes no change. So one thing is because people put more, they mind more the chances of getting caught versus the punishment. So if you do raise the chances of getting caught, meaning you put more officers out there, you do see a change in deterrence. So for example, I'll give myself, I used to drive my bike on the sideways to work, and then they started giving fines to people right on the sidewalk, and I stopped doing that. I actually stopped driving, now I walk to work. And this would help, meaning increased enforcement does help, But if they would leave the enforcement as is and would also say, no, you don't get a 500 shekel fine, you will get a 1,000 shekel fine, this would not help. This would not change the behavior of people. One reason is because people underestimate their chances of getting caught. So would say, okay, well, you know, they'll put me a life sentence for driving on the sidewalk, but they'll never catch me, so who cares? Another main reason is, I saw you laughing when I gave you our nice elderly robber, and the reason that you laughed is that no one and no criminal, or actually most criminals, do not do this calculation. People perform felonies, mostly street felonies, meaning violence, breakthrough, and such, because of a variety of reasons, and rational decision making is the least of. It's because they're addicted to drugs or alcohol, or because they got, you know, caught up in being very excited, so they made a felony. It's a variety of reasons, and people do not calculate. And actually, when they did studies in which they asked people, what did you think of when you did, I don't know, the murder or something, most, like the vast majority of people, do not even think about the punishment that they're going to get. It's just not something that is calculated when you actually perform felonies. Another reason is because, well, if I'm going to ask you now, what is the punishment for armed robbery? Like, I don't know.
10 years.
10 years? Like, and I'm going to rephrase. How much people actually get for armed robbery? Like, not what's written in the law. The law says, I think, about 10 years.
5 years.
5 years? 3 years? Okay, so as you can see, if we can throw hands around, people actually don't know what the punishment for armed robbery. I'm actually a criminal justice lawyer, and in order to see what the punishment. Yeah, so you actually, okay, I need to get my case law right, you know, the trends. People don't actually know. There is some kind of like common understanding, which is many times wrong, about how much people get. And most necessarily when the law is changed, you know, because again, there was this guy who robbed the elderly and now we're going to double the sentence. There's no reason that potential criminals would know what the punishment is. So this is another reason why it does not affect the decision maker. And they'll never catch me is actually something we discussed about. And another, yeah.
I think it's not necessarily true because a lot of people who perform armed robbery are part of street gangs and they know what sentences their friends got.
But let's take the street gangs. Even if they do know, and generally like organized crime and such, the idea is that they become a member of a gang not because they enjoy usually armed robbery, but because of the social tension that are performed them, because the organization pays for them and for their families. Meaning that the total reasons that lead them to those armed robberies and such is far more complex than what is the punishment for it. Actually, what the punishment for it is somewhere so low in the decision-making mechanisms, so to use this as our main tool for fighting crime is actually not, it's not effective, most of all. Yeah.
Question, is there a difference between offenses where there is a big difference between the punishment that's prescribed by the law and the actual punishment, which is trends by case law, rather than where the case law follows strictly or almost strictly the legislative punishment? Actually,
in the vast majority of cases, there's a huge difference between the what's ascribed in law and what is actually given, and it's actually part of the system. The sentences are maximum sentences, except for when there are mandatory minimums. Mandatory minimums are still heavily used in the US, and there are a considerable reason for what we saw in the incarceration crisis. And there are a lot of problems with mandatory minimums, but in this case, in this spectrum, they do rise the certainty of punishment, but they have a lot of problems that would make us not want to use them. Like one thing, they promote guilty pleas. So if I can, plead something else, even if I didn't do it, only to escape the mandatory minimum, I will do it. Because if I do go to court, I might get the mandatory minimum. And there are a lot of other problems with mandatory minimums, but they do solve this specific problem, yeah.
Are there mandatory minimums in Israel?
There are a few actually. Like back a decade ago, there was this huge trend where like everything got mandatory minimums. But actually, there's case law that says that you can put the mandatory minimum on to be served only if he does another crime or as civil work. So there are all kind of ways that case law kind of tried to move the mandatory minimums around. So they're not as harsh as in the US. And actually, nowadays the trend kind of went down. I think a lot of because of the problem of guilty pleas and because they saw that mandatory minimums kind of distort the system and the play between the parties. So now they don't use it that much, although they could come back. Like it's a running trend, we can call it. But then, okay, a bit to what this guy was saying. Okay, so what happens? Okay, but we can't stop sending people to prison because the crime rates will go up the roof. And here we actually have the really interesting example of Finland. And like just to put Finland in perspective, this is more or less the incarceration rate in Europe. So we have over here the former Soviet Union, which uses incarceration quite a bit. This is Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and these are the Nordic countries. As you can see, as we always say, the Nordic countries are really nice. They don't use prison a lot. They just hug over there all the time. You know, it's a really lovely place to live. So as you can see, all the Nordic countries use prison quite in a low rate, and they use a lot of alternatives to incarceration. They actually have a really nice system, but Finland was not as nice as its friends up until 90. So you could see, like, if we zoom in on the Nordic countries, you could see that Finland had, in comparison, quite a large incarceration rate. So if they had somewhere around 60 people per 1,000, Finland had nearly 200 per 1,000 population. And then it had this big prison reform and went down and became as nice as the other Nordic countries. And you would expect, okay, if we reduce by 2/3 our prison population, okay, the crime must go up the roof, right? And what we see is that actually there is an increase in the crime rate in the Nordic countries ever since the 50s to now. But what we can see, Finland is somewhere here in the middle. It does not jump up more than everyone else. Like, it reduced its prison population by 2/3, but the rise in crime was similar to all the other countries who never had those. So you can see, I think it's a very strong example to show that there really is no logical connection between the use of the prison sentence and the crime rate. Yeah.
So I think there is a bit of a problem when you mix two metrics. One is number of prisoners per 100,000 population, and the other is the percentage of crime of like sentences that are imprisonment. Because in one case, for this metric, you have the effect of prior incarceration. But for people who were incarcerated in, I don't know, 1940s or something, then they get out of prison and then, but since people are not put in prison anymore, I mean, it's two different metrics.
Okay, these are two different metrics. What can you study from this to this? Like, these are two different metrics. They don't need to combine. And I do agree these are two different metrics. What I'm saying is that you would expect the crime rate in Finland to behave very differently than the crime rate in the other countries. So because they had this really major reform. And what you see is that it's not that change. This is what I'm trying to make out of these graphs, not more than that. Yeah.
What about Singapore? I understand that in there there's the punishment is severe and the crime is really down.
I must admit, I don't know. So I don't want to just make up things. But what we do see many times, and we're not going to get that the reasons for why there is or there is no crime are actually much wider than the criminal justice system. So, for example, if you have a welfare state, the crime rates are lower, and it's because of the welfare. It's not because of how much people they put in prison. Yeah.
I'm wondering about this measure of crime rate. I mean, I imagine that you know, with your scooter riding on the sidewalk would not be counted there. Right?
No,
unless you were caught, maybe, right? And then you have to pay a fine and so on. But the point, right? If people are riding on the sidewalk all the time, I doubt that most of them appear in Israel as crime rate.
There is a somewhat stable rate of how much people report certain crimes. So for some crimes, we have a virtually 100% report rate. Homicides, things that have to do with insurance. For example, if your apartment got broken into because you need the insurance, it's virtually close to 100. We have other areas in which there's a very low report rate. For example, if your bikes get stolen, in most times, actually going to the police would do nothing, and unless you actually want it for your insurance, you want to do it. There's a big question, for example, about sex felonies, how much is there versus how much is reported. But for all of these, the report rate is pretty stable. So example, if this goes up or this goes down, will not tell us how much crime there really is in a country. And it differs, like the report rate differs between countries. The more you trust the police, you'll report more. But it does tell you, does it go up or does it go down? Because there's no reason to believe that the report rate had changed so dramatically, especially not in these countries. Like there wasn't a big, down rate or up rate in how much you believe the police.
Just the
Yeah.
scenario. Let's say that car theft is highly reported. And since the 1950s, there is lots more cars in society.
Yeah, but again, once you put everything together, so yeah, kinds of crime do change, but in the meaning of the overall trend, it gives you, even if you can say, oh, well, we have 10,000 and you know, really put some essence in this number, the trends do give you the picture. There were other? No. And now I want to stop talking about international comparisons, and now I want to give you a bit of who are the people in prison in Israel. Does this, like, when you think of people in prison, what you usually think about are the sex felonies, you think about these our nice armed robber, you think about homicide, but the vast majority of prisoners are actually in very short prison sentences. So as you can see, I thought I had the numbers, but I think the common number is that about 75% of prisoners are up to 2 years in prison, and everybody else are in the long tail. So when we talk about the use of prison, we usually imagine those very serious felonies, but the people who are actually going into prison are most of the time for medium range felonies. So if it's a really low felony, he will usually not go to prison, but kind of like the medium range is the vast majority of people in prison who just change. So, and one problem with the prison sentence is that it has what we call the criminogenic effect. Meaning, if there's one thing that will determine if someone will go to prison again, yes or not, is the question, was he in prison before? People who were in prison are to a vastly larger ratio go back to prison. And there are a few explanations to why this is happening, one of which is that people are getting accustomed to prison, meaning once you've been to prison for, let's say, 6 months, you're not as scared of it as people who come out. We actually have this really big problem with the minors, meaning a minor who was arrested for the first 3 days, let's say 2 weeks, he will do everything to go out of prison. He will agree to go to rehabilitation plans. He will agree to take all kind of restrictions and such. But after he's been like a month and a half in prison, well, you get accustomed to stuff. And prison is actually, you can live with there. And no one is asking you to do anything. And you've got your friends. And okay, well, I'm not going to go to rehab now. Rehab is hard. And it's actually a great problem with minors, but also with adults. People get accustomed to prison. So, and in prison, they get a network of other people who are criminals, and many times they get disconnected from their previous environment, from their previous community, and this is the only community they know. They have a really hard time going back to society in regards to work, to employment, to finding an apartment. So all of these things, actually, what we call the rotating door, that put people back to prison, basically because they have nothing else to look for outside once they're going out of prison. So we do have a really important mission to try to prevent those short-time sentences, because I think we can all agree that if someone, raped another woman, he should be in prison. It's not actually, like in most cases, it won't be debatable.
So what crimes are we talking about?
We're talking about breaking into apartments, like in really, like in small numbers. We're talking about we're talking about drug felonies. We're talking about battery and assault in a really low key. We're talking about slightly larger theft. So this is like really low violence act or mediocre property felonies, basically, and drug felonies, yeah.
Isn't that just the fact of getting convicted enough to put you into this cycle, even without going to prison?
Not to the same extent. I mean, yes, and we'll talk about alternatives to the criminal process. There is some problem when you get convicted. So it has some of these effects, but the effects of taking you out of the community, of isolating you, and of making you like recreate your sense of identity, this happens to a large extent in prison and will not happen if you still live with your family, if you still go to work, and all of these things. So the idea, the concept of isolating you is one of the harsher effects of prison. Like, this is the huge amount of the punishment, and it's also the one thing that has the most effect on what happens next. So actually, so I'm going to go back to the money in a second. So there was actually this very important committee set in 2015, led by the Supreme Justice Dalia Dorner, and that's why it's called the Dorner Report. And he actually tried to rethink criminal justice policy in Israel. And unlike most of these committees, this is actually really, like, it got implemented in a government decision. Now there are following reports on how everything should change. Like, it really had its wave and is something that is very real in criminal justice today. It's not something like, okay, let's take our report, put it in a nice drawer, and carry on with our lives, which is usually happening with such reports. So the Dorner reports had a few very important suggestions. One is, as we started talking about what you think about what happens in prisons and what works and what doesn't, and data is sometimes very different, is to try to create data-based criminal justice policy. So you know, if you're a member of parliament and you want to propose a bill to increase the punishment for something, first get your data right. Would it help? What are the specific attributes of these populations? All of the things. How much would it cost? So first to try, so now following the Dorner report, every bill in regards to criminal justice policy needs to have like this little research on how it actually going to affect, and not what you think because you read it in the papers. Another thing is extending the community courts, which we'll come to in a second. to increase the use of early release and parole. Early release, what we call shlish, like when you go home after 2/3 of your prison sentence. The rates of using parole has actually radically decreased in Israel. It used to be about like 65% of people would get parole, and now we're talking about around 25% of prisoners. And the problem is that people tend to see parole as some kind of a reward. Like, okay, you've behaved nice in prison, we'll let you go early. But I don't think it's actually the right way to think of parole, because what we do when you do parole is you get this, I don't know, a few months or and sometimes a few years in which you still have a lot of leverage against in-persons. Like, okay, you're going to go to rehab or you're going to go to prison. So you can actually help a person go back to society, like hand in hand and one step at a time. So, okay, let's get you back together with your family, or if this is harsh, let's put you in a rehabilitation center. Okay, let's do this. Why don't you go to work? Okay, and we'll follow and we'll help you go back to work. So when you finally finish your prison sentence and parole, you can actually go back, and the revolving door will not be standing right there in front of you, because, okay, you've done it one step at a time. Whilst if you don't get parole, they're just like, at some point your prison sentence ends and you just go out and there's nothing. There's no support group, you have nowhere to work, you have nowhere to live many times, and you just like crash into the revolving door basically. And I think one of the things Donor reported said is that we need to rethink our use of early release. It's not a reward, it's something that we do in order to protect society basically. They did, in order to reduce the number of short-time prison sentences, they did say, okay, let's allow more time for community work. Now in Israel, community work is limited to 6 months, and there was a bill that changed it to 9 months. So, okay, some of these people can work more time, so we can avoid those short prison sentences and the open prisons, which we'll talk about in a second. And the one thing that I wanted to add was, okay, where's the money? How much does it cost, all this prison? And the thing is, it's really costly. It's a lot of money to put people in prison. So if you put people in prison, this is the first row, it's about 120,000 shekels a year per prisoner. And if you take care of it in the community, meaning a hostel or parole officer, etc., it's somewhere between 5,000 to let's say 50,000 per year. So
these numbers to 10,000 shekels per month?
Per month, yeah. From the prison organization. I forgot the name. From the Shabbat. Like these are the prison's numbers. This is what they base their budget on.
Yeah, but they probably have to. I mean, even if you lower the number of prisoners, then you still have to pay some costs for the number of guards might be like not lower the same way, and of course the facilities you still have to pay for them. So I'm not sure. This might contain a lot of overhead which you can't reduce if you reduce the number of prisoners.
I think it depends on how much you reduce, right?
I mean, I don't pay for myself at like 10,000 shekels for food, for transportation, for...
Yeah, but you don't need guards guarding you 24/7. You don't need education. You don't need a counselor. You don't need special people to drive you from one place to another. That includes guards. The cost of keeping a prisoner safe and going to the doctor and going to his court sessions and not fighting with the other prisoners and making sure he does not commit suicide, sometimes are very pricey. For example, in a maximum security prison, those rates would go really up. Like making sure, for example, an ex-officer does not get killed in prison, that costs a lot. For other, it would be cheaper.
If I release someone, then immediately
It's not immediately, but it depends. Like if you released, let's say, 1,000 people, you might be able.
I'm able to
Yeah, you made, and that would several. And actually, if you look, if you look at the numbers, though, actually, like if you compare it from 2010, there was a really substantial drop. Like we're talking 2,000 people. This is about 3 prisons. This is a lot of money.
Sounds like,
Yeah.
What was the graph before?
Which one? The before.
We just talked about, so we talked from 2010 until now, so what happened before? But it was on the rise and then started falling down?
It's complicated, basically. Like there were a lot of trends. Like now, if we talk about like prison history from the 50s to now, that's going to require a longer talk, basically.
What the 423 includes, does it include rehabilitation programs or just the maintenance or adultery?
This is basically the salary of the parole officer divided by the number of people he can treat. So this is like if the guy is going to the community, meaning he lives at his own home, and the parole officer basically like manages him. So that's the lower number. And this is if he is in a hostel.
Okay.
So this is why I said like we'll take it from 5,000 to 50,000. So there is like some prisoners, well, they can live at home, they can work. You just need to make sure they don't do anything wrong, and that would be the cheaper one. And some of them will need to go to a drug rehabilitation center, which is very expensive. But still, it's even in the expensive side, it's still much lower than a prison sentence in amount. Yeah.
One, I always have problem, and again, I like the main theme, but I always have problem with aggregated numbers. Have you done segmentation by age and by crime type? Because
Crime time?
crime type. My hypothesis is that it will be very beneficial. Again, I'm just shooting off my hip. It will be very, very beneficial for my youngers. If you decide not to send to prison people below 18, and then try to find them some sort of army service. We can use the army as some sort of rehabilitation service.
It does actually happen. It's a major figure.
Because my hypothesis is that if someone starts getting to jail when he's young, he's going to stay in jail all his life. He's going to go and back and forth. This is the research that I always see. Like they always talk about the African Americans. Is that the problem that because in the U.S. because it's not an ideal place, and some places, some people discriminate people because they color their skin. Allegedly, young African Americans get easily into jail at the 14, 15s, and then they became exposed to all the criminals, and then become criminals. So I would say it seems like a great tool for young people and for crimes that are I would say, on the border between non-intentional crimes, or I don't know what to say.
I'll answer first. Regarding juvenile criminal justice, there's a huge difference between the Israel and the US, and it used to be like this for all the time. In the US, basically, for harsher felonies, they treat juveniles as if they were adults, and they send them to unthinkable times in prison. In Israel, this is not the case. In order to be a juvenile and get into prison, meaning into the Ofek prison, which is the juvenile prison, you need to drop out of a long list of places before. The entire system tries, and I'm saying it as a public defender, tries its best in order not to send young and juvenile people to prison. The amount, I think now in Ofek, there are about 150 juveniles, and these are all the juveniles from the entire country. There is a substantial attempt in order to try to rehabilitate juveniles. So I'm putting juveniles out. They do go to prison only in the hardest cases. And in this way, Ofek, in a way, is the most difficult prison in Israel. Like the average adult prisoner would be much easier than the average juvenile in Ofek. So I'm putting juveniles aside. And as we said, the group that we're talking about, we're not talking about the killers and the rapists. We're talking about this huge amount of, as we said, it's not that they're unintentional crimes. For unintentional crimes, unless you killed someone, you will not go to prison. But if it's your first time, or let's say, it's not your first time, but it's kind of like something that has to do with your drug addiction. You could go back, to 7 months in prison over and over and again. But besides us paying you to go to prison for 7 months, it won't help in any way. So we need to rethink it, not because you deserve it, but because it would be cheaper and it would be more effective to think about it in other ways. Because just putting you to these 7 or 9 months in prison would just do no good, except of you coming out, coming out, coming in, coming out. And it could actually happen a lot of times. So now we have 10 more minutes to kind of like give you some of these new ideas, new ways of thinking, that we now have in order to think, okay, so we have, this young drug addict who comes in and out of prison, and we're trying to rethink what to do with him. And now I'm going to answer the question, then we're going to see this beautiful video of the community courts. Yeah?
Before we go to solutions, two main parameters that you discussed were deterrence and cost.
Yeah.
So if you want to solve deterrence and cost, you can just have like mandatory capital punishment for any felony. You solve everything.
It will not solve everything because it's immoral to kill people for everything.
That's another parameter.
Oh, yeah, okay, I'm adding basic humanity in here. And if...
No, fast execution.
Yeah.
That's not in the States, like a child.
I would suggest the opposite.
So I think that there's no
Okay, so I'm going to propose your idea of vicious, like a dictatorship to my boss, and we'll see what comes. So basically, there is no. Unless you go and kill everybody for like stealing stuff, what you're going to do is put them in prison for a long time, which will not be helpful.
And if I may, if you think about, for example, Saudi Arabia, where they chop off thieves' hands and they behead the rapists and drug dealers, crime doesn't stop there. It still continues, as it seems, because they're still chopping heads and arms.
Okay. I'm not quite sure, actually. Okay, so one thing I want to show you, and how may I say it, I'm sorry for this video. What we see here, okay, we'll let them sing for a second. The amazing singer here is the judge. She's the judge. And the people singing with her are the prosecutor, the defender, and the defendants in the community court. So as you can see,
you
they
might
are
want to
not...
repeat that because the music was really high.
Yeah, so what I said was that...
You don't get to
this is how they're elected, and their ability to use the camera, right? This is another main feature. So the woman with the big belt and the white shirt on the middle was the judge. On the other side were the prosecutor and the defendant and the defense attorney. And as you can see, they're singing, not very good. And what happens in the community courts, which now there are 3 and are going to be 6 by the end of the year, is, okay, we take our drug addict who comes in and out of jail. And we figure out, okay, coming in and out of jail does not help us. This is what we said before. So the community courts they're trying to use the authority of the criminal process and the authority of the judge in order to help people to get all the help they need in order to be rehabilitated. And they can be rehabilitated from addiction, they can have a lot of other issues, they can be lonely, they can have a lot of debt they can't handle. So once you go to the community court, it's a regular court, it's in the court system. There's one in Ramle, one in Tel Aviv, one in Beersheba. So if you agree to go on this, you get into a really long process. It's usually somewhere between a year and 2 years, very intensive, in which you get all the support you want. So you have someone taking care that you'd go to rehab, someone helping you find employment, someone helping you with the kids if you don't have anywhere to put them, someone helping you with parents' guidance, whatever you need. So every person in the community courts gets what he or she needs. And there's actually a really big group of different professionals there to help them do what they do. And as long as they're in this process and do what they need to do with all the help they get, in the end, the case will be overcharged, or they get like a no punishment at all, something of this sort. So actually what they do is they use the stress that is caused out of the criminal process and the fear that you know you might go to prison and all of this in order to gently push you into a community that supports you and helps you try to figure out what's the main problems you have. So another name for the community court is problem-solving courts. So the idea is that the people who go there go to break the law because there are other underlying problems, like the criminal involvement is only the peak of the iceberg, and we need to go down and figure out, okay, why was she or he doing what he did? And they're actually a very good success rate. It's about 2 years old, the project, so they're only the first people who are coming out, and for now the recidivism rate is really low. The people say they trust the system, that they trust the government and the regime much more, and people are actually managing to regain control over their lives using the community court. So this is one thing that is happening, is now actually increasing, so they will be in each of the districts by the end of 2019, I think. Did you have a question?
Who's been pushing this initiative?
Who came up with the idea is actually a young doctor called Daniela Beinish. She studied problem-solving courts in the US and finished her PhD. She joined with Ashalim Joint, which is a part of Joint, and they joined in and convinced the court system and the prosecution and everyone to come along and try it.
Sorry, but I guess my question was, so it went through the court system, or?
She is an actual judge. Like she judges other cases. It's in the court. It's part of the court. It's a regular court. And if you fail out, you know, you will be given a sentence according to what you did.
I understand. Again, my question was this something that did it come from elected officials or from judges, or?
The idea came with Daniela from the US. She came here and she actually convinced everybody else.
Who was the decision maker?
In the end, I think it was the court system. Like they needed to say, okay, we're going to do. But you know, if the prosecution would say, we're not going to go to this sing-along, it would never happen. Like the really amazing thing is that she managed to put everyone around the table and say, okay, we're going to try this. And at first, like people looked at her like, I don't know, this hippie from the US, what you're talking about. But now, actually, like it's something that is really gained confidence. People really believe in this, and it's quite amazing to go there. Yeah.
I have a question. You said in the beginning of your talk that there's no correlation, or we think there's no correlation between jail time and the crime rates. But you said that there is correlation between the chances of me getting caught and the crime rates. So if we increase number of police officers and so on, that will reduce the crime rate, right?
Yeah, you're totally.
So I'm wondering, why don't we just use why don't we shorten all jail times, or instead of like what you just described, the community court sounds really warm and fuzzy. But if we took that budget and instead of that we had more police officers out there, wouldn't that do much better? Wouldn't that do much better results?
First, I do agree totally that if we lower the budget of the prison system and put the money in police, that would reduce the crime rate more. Meaning we first need, like, a lot of crime would go down if we increase enforcement. So this is correct. I don't think that it would actually solve these kind of cases. The cases that come to the community court are cases mostly of repeating crime that, again, comes from underlying problems. the people, that have no money to feed their kids would steal even if they know they get caught, because they just have no other option. If he's a drug addict, he will go and steal because he feels he has no other way to go. So in these cases, which are actually a large number of the reasons that lead people to crime, the only way to actually try and make a difference is to try to solve the underlying problem. If not, you can put them, you will have less crime because they will be in prison more, but in many of the cases, deterrence itself will not cause them to stop because they see no other way.
Do you feel that the punishments today for light crimes is too long or too short, or?
I think they send too many people to prison. If you're in prison, for me, it doesn't matter that much if you're there for 6 months or for 12 months. It's not the length, it's the fact of putting you to prison. It has so much effect, so much bad effects, that this is what I want to stop for. And I think this is more important, the question, do you put someone to 3 years or to 5 years? I mean, for this person, I guess it's really important. But when we look at it as a policy question, I think this is what we need to put our finger on. The open prison is actually another thing that is just starting. It's really, it's used a lot in Europe, which is, we said that one of the main problems of prison as we know it is that it isolates you from your community, from your work, for everything. So what they're creating now, and there's actually one going to be created in Israel, it's building up right now, is open prisons. The idea is that, okay, you need to serve your time, so you need to have some restrictions on your liberty, but you don't necessarily need to be isolated from everything. So what an open prison is, it's usually, as you can see, here it's from the UK, it's a nice little neighborhood, basically, and sometimes it will be a building within a city or 2 buildings within a city, that people are there. They need to be there in certain hours. They need their entire daily agenda is set up for them. In the morning you go, you have your breakfast, you go to work, then you go to therapy, then I don't know, you may have an hour off, and then you come back and you sleep at the prison. But the idea is that you can maintain some of your connections to the community. Again, so when you finish your prison time, you have somewhere to go. So okay, you have your workplace. You continue to work the entire time. The idea is to try to find a punishment that in some ways restricts your liberty, and none of us would want to go and live in an open prison. It is punishment, but it does not have all the bad influences that a prison time has. And you say, well, they can run away. The idea is that many prisoners go out and come back, and they go to vacations. Prisoners don't run that much as you might think. The teaspoon that you're carving your way to freedom, that doesn't happen. Most of the prisoners go out to vacations, they go back. They know the price for not coming back is enormous. And they figure out, well, I'd rather spend my prison time and not sit another few years for an attempt to run away. And this is what the open prisons are about. So, yeah, people might run away, but actually the chances are not very big, and the people who go there to begin with are people with medium crimes. They're not very dangerous, so it actually works very well in Europe. Yeah.
It sounds like more people with financial problems will want to go in than people who want to go out. Free court watching.
Yeah, well, as I said, I'm not quite sure any of us would say, no.
If you remember Mr. Machiavelli from David Copperfield, I think he sort of did that in the debtors' prison.
Another thing that is happening right now and is pushing people out of prison, basically, in a matter of policy, is the overcrowding decision of the Supreme Court. Just last year, Justice Rubinstein set a case law that said that the prisons are way overcrowded and it's unconstitutional. So the state, by April 2019, need to reduce its prison population in order to fit the overcrowding decision. So this is one reason why everybody's in a hurry to reduce the prison system. And another important case law to note that kind of helps this is an old case law from 2009, which abolished prison privatization in Israel, One of the reasons that caused the high rise in the US was private prisons. And once the option of private prisons was actually blocked in Israel in 2009, it actually, in a way, stopped the amount in which the prisons can rise, because it's really expensive to build a public prison. So just like, that there is also these decisions that kind of help with the kind of support all the criminal justice reforms. And that's that.
So if we have, let's give a chance to people from the VC to ask some questions.
So the graph showing that the population of imprisonees are declining. Do we attribute that to the donor committee changes or to something else?
It's not due to the donor report, because we saw the decline a bit earlier, and also the implementation of the donor report in like everyday cases is just in its beginning. It's actually a good question why we see one major reason is because the crime rates are going down. Actually, the number of cases are going down in Israel quite dramatically. So there are just fewer prisoners because there are fewer cases. It's more about that than about the donor report.
Do you know why?
Well, because the crime rates are dropping, which is...
Yeah, but why?
Why is a good question. There's not actually a straight answer, because there's also a global trend of lowered crime rates. It has to do with the population getting a bit richer, and meaning a lot of macro explanations, none of them we can be sure of. It's actually a really good question why the crime rates is dropping, because it's also dropping worldwide. So trying to explain it with one policy decision or other is probably wrong. We just know it happens. No one quite knows for sure why it's dropping, but it is.
A different question.
Yeah.
I used to have a blog. I was a big fan of it. You start updating the blog. What happened?
Actually, I forgot to pay my hosting, and they deleted it. Okay. It was very sad. Actually, I also got Ran's blog deleted because I forgot to pay his hosting as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
One question.
Please use the mic. Because it will be heard for the recording.
Everybody asks a question without a microphone. I'll do the same, please. Okay, so this discussion takes into account the criminal and the rehabilitation possibilities and everything, but I didn't hear anything about the society, what it expects about justice, and especially the victims. I didn't hear the word victim here even once. And what about their need for justice and their need for personal safety? If they see the guy, if the grandma who was robbed sees the one who robbed her getting out, or not even getting in prison, I mean, you can tell her all that, but in many cases she won't believe, she won't trust the law enforcement system anymore, and might not report.
I'll try and answer, because the question of victims' rights movement is actually a large question. I will say a few things. First, I think that the most important places for the victims' rights movements are actually in the more severe sentences. It's not about the short sentences, because as we said, in severe violence, in the armed robbery, people would sit along 4 or 5 years. In sex offenses, people would sit a long time. And I think our need to address the victims is most important in these cases. In the cases in which the crime created substantial trauma, sometimes substantial risk or substantial harm to the victims. And I think that in many cases, actually, criminal law reform and victims' rights would go hand in hand. For example, I would say that the government needs to compensate victims' rights. For example, what's happening now is that usually the offender is said, okay, you need to compensate the victim with the total, like the maximum for today is 256,000 shekels. And you know, if it's, let's say, a rape case, they would put him, okay, you need to pay 256,000 shekels, and he goes to prison, and he's broke, and the victim will never going to see this money. I mean, even if you turn the rapist upside down and, you know, shake it, there will be no money out of it because he has no money. And I think, in a way, putting the victim vis-a-vis the offender is a way the government can walk away from. And I think we need to compensate by the government, the victims.
And doesn't want the money.
Okay.
The victim wants to see the
Let me answer.
Right?
No, this is another thing. No.
Want the retaliation.
No.
That's the original.
Yeah, but the thing is that studies and discussions with victims showed that victims are many people, and victims want many things. Some victims want to see their offender suffer. They want them never to go out of prison. There are some victims. Other victims do what we call, I forgot the English term, but the idea is that they meet their offender, and what they want is their offender to say, I'm sorry. And what they want is some kind of acknowledgement of what was done to them. And there are actually these arenas in which offender and victim can meet. It's done in therapy and so on, so it's not like, oh, go meet him somewhere. And the offender says, I now acknowledge what I did to you, and I am sorry, and I will try to make it better. And we have a lot of victims saying, this meant more to me. And we actually have this, it's a kind of a well-known story of this woman who was actually better. She was beaten very hard, and then like she got, I think she had like a head injury or something, like something really serious. And she goes and she meets this young man who did this to her. And she actually understands how, for him, it actually changed his entire life. He got like 15 years in prison or something like that. And she goes and she meets him, and he sees what he did to her and acknowledges what he did to her. And he says, and she actually like kind of, she keeps in touch with him while he's in prison. And this gives him a sense of meaning that he somehow managed to, not to make right, but to acknowledge what he did. And she feels that she has some kind of meaning. And this sense of meaning, and actually, yes, money to pay for therapy, money to pay for a lot of things that many times victims want. Some of the victims want nothing to do. They don't want to hear it. They just want to move on with their lives. And actually, when you actually talk to victims or with advocates of victims, you see victim wants a lot of things. And there was actually a few cases in which like the prosecution says, well, you need to send him to a long time in prison because of the victim. And the victim says, I don't care if he goes to prison. I just want to move on with my life. So trying to speak in the name of victims and assume what victims want is something I really don't like. I think that we need to listen to victims and what we want. And I think that in many times, actually, the defendant rights and the victim rights would go hand in hand, because in a way they are the two humans in the system, and many times looking at them and what they need and what they think would make them make different decisions than what the system would decide.
And the offender would still be convicted. So yeah. Just like, I mean, in terms of justice in the most sense, the criminal punishment would still be there, and it would serve in the future if he comes back and do the same thing for some reason. The only thing that changes is the way the actual punishment. It's not the conviction itself.
But also, as I said, victims' rights are mostly relevant to the really harsher crimes, which are actually a different talk than the shorter prison sentences that usually have no victim. For example, like in a drug offense, there is no victim. It's wrong, and we put people in prison for it, but there is no victim. No one is actually hurt.
So thank you very much. Actually, it was quite fascinating for me to see. I didn't think about it in advance that Googlers are engineers and they think numbers. And we had many project managers here who automatically thought, how do we optimize the system? Where are the flaws here? It was very interesting to me. So thank you very much.